kind-hearted waitress gave a scruffy man a cup of coffee and lost the job she had devoted 5 years to. But what she didn't know was that the scruffy man wasn't homeless at all, and that one small act of kindness was about to turn her entire life upside down. A story of compassion, challenge, and an unexpected reward from the last place anyone would expect. The Tuesday afternoon slipped by quietly along the narrow streets of Maplewood. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the glass windows of the Maplewood diner, casting gentle beams onto the worn wooden tables. It wasn't a fancy restaurant, nor a trendy coffee shop, but it had a charm of its own, a cozy, familiar warmth, like a morning cup of coffee, or the lingering scent of freshly made pancakes on your fingertips. Behind the counter, Emily Carter pulled her faded apron up higher, tying the knot securely behind her back. 5 years of working here had made her intimately familiar with every corner of the diner, every quirk of its patrons. She knew old Mr. Miller always wanted his waffles drowned in syrup, but never finished them. Mrs. Jenkins liked her toast perfectly crisp, but never burnt. And Ben, the bookish regular, always sat in the same spot by the window where the light fell just right. Emily wasn't just a waitress. She was a part of this diner, a keeper of names, a listener to stories. But few knew that behind her warm smile was a heart heavy with burdens. Her mother was still in the hospital, recovering from recent surgery, while medical bills piled up like the order slips she scribbled on every day. Her younger brother, Luke, was applying to college, but the family's finances couldn't stretch that far. Rent loomed like an unrelenting shadow, never patient, never waiting. Emily's life felt like an endless race, one where she had to keep running without ever pausing to catch her breath. Yet no matter how tough things got, she showed up at the diner every day, flashing that smile and whispering to herself, kindness cost nothing. The diner's door swung open again, letting in a gust of cold air along with the footsteps of a man. He looked weary, his coat tattered at the elbows, his old shoes faded by time. He moved slowly, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Emily couldn't help but notice she'd served hundreds, maybe thousands of people, but this man's eyes, tired, cautious, brimming with untold stories, made her pause. He approached the counter but didn't rush to order. Instead, he quietly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of loose change. His rough, calloused fingers, weathered by years of hardship, carefully counted each coin. His eyes betrayed a flicker of worry as he realized the meager sum wouldn't even cover the smallest cup of coffee. Emily's heart clenched. She glanced around the diner. Mr. Grayson, the manager, stood not far off, watching everything with his stern, unyielding gaze. He'd always been strict about never giving anything away for free. But it was just a cup of coffee, a voice in her head whispered. If he doesn't get coffee, he might have to keep wandering out there in the late afternoon chill. She looked at the man again. He seemed like someone who hadn't felt anything warm all day. A decision began to take shape in her mind. She reached for a white ceramic mug and stepped toward the steaming coffee pot nearby. She was about to do what her heart told her to, unaware that this small act of kindness was about to change her life forever. A gentle breeze slipped through the crack in the door, carrying the chill of the late afternoon. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands absently fidgeting with a rag, though her eyes never strayed from the stranger who had just walked in. He wasn't in a hurry. His steps were slow, heavy, as if each one was a struggle. His faded wool coat, frayed at the elbows, hung loosely over his gaunt frame. His gray, unkempt hair was dusted with specks of dirt, as though it had been ages since it last met a comb. But it was his eyes that had seen countless lonely days, that truly caught Emily's attention. He approached the counter but didn't sit down like the other customers. Instead, he stood silently for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the menu on the wall before dropping, as if wrestling with some inner dilemma. A trembling hand reached into his coat pocket, fumbling through the worn fabric. After a beat, he pulled out a handful of coins, placing them one by one onto the counter with his rough, calloused hands. Clink, clink, clink. The coins rolled briefly before he bowed his head, counting them carefully as if hoping for a miracle, that somehow this meager amount might stretch far enough for a hot cup of coffee. But then, after a quiet pause, he let out a soft sigh. Emily stared at the coins. Altogether, less than $1. She didn't need to, asked. She knew exactly what he wanted. Coffee. Something simple, something anyone could have, but for him it was a luxury. She cast a discreet glance toward Mr. Grayson, the diner's manager. He stood at the far end near the cash register, his sharp, cold eyes surveying everything. Grayson didn't tolerate handouts. He believed the diner wasn't a charity. If someone couldn't pay, they didn't belong. Emily knew that. But she also knew what it felt like to have the world turn its back on you. The warmth from the coffee pot beside her enveloped her senses. She knew what she could do. Without a flicker of hesitation, she grabbed a ceramic mug and poured it full of steaming coffee. The rich brown liquid flowed smoothly, tendrils of steam curling into the air like faint wisps of magic. Yet she touched the side of the mug, feeling the heat seep into her fingertips, then gently set it in front of the man. He looked up, startled, his eyes a mix of surprise and suspicion. "It's on me," Emily whispered, her voice soft and kind. "I've got you." After a brief hesitation, the man reached out, slowly accepting the mug. His bony hands trembled, whether from emotion or the cold that had settled deep into his flesh, she couldn't tell. He lifted the cup as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The steam brushed against his weathered face, and his gaze softened. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice hoarse and faint but brimming with sincerity. But just then, a faint scoff broke the moment from a nearby table. Emily didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. A middle-aged woman, dressed impeccably in an expensive emerald green dress, was frowning in her direction. Beside her, an older man raised an eyebrow in clear disapproval. "Here we go again," the woman muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know why this place keeps attracting people like that these days." Emily clenched her jaw. She was used to those scornful looks, the kind from people who thought kindness was a luxury, that helping someone was unnecessary. The atmosphere in the diner shifted. Some customers glanced at the man, a few whispered among themselves. Suspicious eyes began to emerge. But Emily didn't care. She only watched the man in front of her, saw how he brought the coffee to his lips, and took a small sip. And in that fleeting moment, she caught a glimpse of peace in his eyes. That was all she needed to know. What she didn't realize was that, from across the room, Mr. Grayson had seen everything, and the real storm was still brewing just out of sight. The air in the diner suddenly grew heavy, as if someone had accidentally dropped a plate, but instead of shattering, it hung suspended mid-fall, dragging a tense silence over everything. Emily felt it. She looked at the man in front of her, his rough hands clutching the ceramic mug tightly, as if he feared that letting go would make the warmth vanish, but in his weathered eyes, just for a fleeting moment, she saw something, gentle. Then, abruptly, a voice sliced through the quiet like a cold, sharp blade. "Emily." She froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Mr. Grayson, the manager of the diner, a man who kept watch over every pancake, every cup of coffee, every coin that clinked into the register, as if his soul were tethered to the numbers. He wasn't a bad person, but he wasn't one for empathy, either. To him, the diner wasn't a place for dispensing kindness. It was a business machine, where anything that left the counter unpaid was a loss. Emily swallowed hard. She didn't turn around right away. She glanced at the man in front of her, noticing how he ducked his head slightly, like a guilty child, as if he too knew what was coming. "Emily." This time Mr. Grayson's voice was firmer. She took a deep breath and turned. There he stood, just behind the cash register, his piercing eyes locked onto her, arms crossed, eyebrows raised in scrutiny. "What are you doing?" Emily didn't answer immediately. A few customers began to glance over. Some raised curious eyebrows, others whispered to each other. In the corner, the middle-aged woman from earlier sipped her tea, her lips curling into a faint smirk as if anticipating an entertaining drama about to unfold. Emily met Mr. Grayson's gaze, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "I just gave him a cup of coffee. Did he pay for it?" A simple question, one they both knew the answer to. Emily didn't reply right away. She glanced down at the counter, where the scattered coins still lay, silent remnants of a broken dream. Then she looked up. No. That single word echoed through the diner like a stone dropping into a still pond. Mr. Grayson inhaled sharply, then stepped toward her slowly. "You know the rules, Emily." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight, something sharp and icy. Emily felt her spine stiffen. She knew she could bow her head, apologize, promise it wouldn't happen again, but she also knew that if she did, she'd be betraying herself. She glanced at the man still clutching the coffee, watching how he shrank into himself, as if trying to become smaller, invisible. Then she turned back to face Mr. Grayson. "It's just a cup of coffee, and it's a free cup of coffee," he shot back, his tone cutting. "We don't run a business on freebies, Emily." A hush fell over the diner. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, some waiting to see what she'd do next, others simply curious, as if watching a play where they weren't the main characters. She took a deep breath. He needed it. Just 3 words, but they were enough to make Mr. Grayson let out a short, dry laugh. "You think you get to decide who needs what around here?" "It's not about authority," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "It's just a little kindness." "Kindness doesn't pay the rent, Emily." Her fists clenched. She knew arguing with Mr. Grayson was pointless. He wasn't a bad man, but he was the kind who put rules above everything. If something didn't have monetary value, to him it wasn't worth considering, but kindness couldn't be measured in dollars. She glanced at the older man again, seeing how he gripped the coffee mug, how he bowed his head as if afraid the kindness he'd just received could be snatched away at any moment, and that made her unable to back down. She turned back to Mr. Grayson, her eyes blazing, her voice steady and unshaken. "It's just a cup of coffee, Mr. Grayson." With those words, she unknowingly lit the spark for a storm she hadn't yet foreseen. A thick, heavy silence draped over the small diner like a suffocating blanket. No one chewed, no one spoke. Even the clink of cutlery against ceramic plates slowed to a cautious hush. Every eye in the room, curious, judgmental, or simply intrigued by an unexpected confrontation, turned toward Emily and Mr. Grayson. The older man, seated at the counter, still gripped the warm ceramic mug in his hands. Steam rose from the coffee, brushing against his weathered face, but it couldn't melt away the chill that now surrounded him. He was used to this feeling, the sensation of being seen as someone who didn't belong. Mr. Grayson stood tall, arms crossed, his icy gaze fixed on Emily. It wasn't the type to lose his temper often, but in this moment every line on his face was taut with irritation. "It's just a cup of coffee." That's what Emily had said, and that's what snapped his patience. "Just a cup of coffee?" Grayson raised an eyebrow, his voice sharp as a blade. "Think about it, Emily. What if everyone walked in here saying they didn't have money but still wanted coffee? Are you going to give free coffee to the whole town?" Emily pressed her lips together. She knew she needed to stay calm, but frustration was rising within her like waves crashing against the shore. "He's not just everyone, Mr. Grayson. He's someone who needs help." "And what about me?" Grayson flung his hands out, his tone growing harsh. "I've got a diner to run. I've got employees to pay. Do you know how much a free coffee every day would cost? If everyone can just take food without paying, why am I even bothering to keep this place open? I'm not saying we should give everything away for free, but not everything has to have a price tag to be worth something. Kindness doesn't pay the rent." Those words stabbed into Emily like a knife. Kindness doesn't pay the rent. Kindness can't cover her mother's hospital bills. Kindness can't get her brother into college. But if that's true, then what's the point of kindness at all? She clenched her fists, feeling her own helplessness. But when she glanced at the man sitting in front of her, his head bowed, shrinking as if he were a stain on the diner's polished surface, she knew she couldn't back down. Emily took a deep breath. "We don't lose anything by being kind to someone, Mr. Grayson. But if we turn our backs on them, we lose something far more valuable." A faint murmur rippled through the diner. A middle-aged man in the corner set his newspaper down, his eyes showing a flicker of approval. But at a table near the counter, the woman in the green dress maintained her smirking expression. "How touching," she drawled, each word dripping with mockery. "But if kindness is free, can I get a free slice of pie, too? I've had a rough day, you know." A few soft chuckles broke out from other customers, not loud, but enough to sting Emily's heart. She stared at the woman. "Have you ever had to count coins just to afford a meal?" The room fell silent again. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by Emily's question. "Have you ever felt the cold creeping into your knuckles, your teeth, with nowhere to go?" No one spoke. "I didn't think so." Emily turned back to Mr. Grayson, her voice soft but resolute. "This isn't about everyone getting something for free. It's about one person for whom a cup of coffee might be the only good thing in their day." She turned to the older man who had been silent all this time. "I don't regret doing this." A long moment passed, but then with a slow shake of his head, Mr. Grayson sighed, delivering the verdict Emily had dreaded from the start. "You don't get to make that call, and if you can't understand my rules." He paused, locking eyes with her. "Then maybe you shouldn't be working here." His words hit like a thunderclap. The diner went so quiet that Emily could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. She looked at Mr. Grayson, her eyes wide with shock but burning with resolve. She'd seen this coming. She knew the consequences of challenging the rules, but that didn't make the words hurt any less. Some customers turned away, unwilling to get involved. Others looked at her with pity. A few kitchen staff peeked out from behind the door, waiting to see what would happen next. But amid all those gazes, only one mattered to her. The man in front of her. He still clutched the coffee mug, his eyes meeting hers, not with pity, but with gratitude, and that told Emily that, no matter what came next, she hadn't been wrong. The air inside the Maplewood diner seemed to freeze solid. No one chewed, no one spoke. Just a heavy silence that crept through every chair, every table, every porcelain plate still streaked with sweet syrup. But at that moment, nothing felt sweet anymore. Emily's gaze remained locked on Mr. Grayson. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, even though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel every beat reverberating in her chest. "Then maybe you shouldn't be working here." Those words fell like an icy blade slicing through the room, severing everything that had still been intact moments before. Emily caught faint whispers, a sharp intake of breath from someone nearby. She saw the woman in the green dress raise an eyebrow with delight, as if she'd just been treated to a tragic play tailored to her taste. She also saw the older man in front of her, the one who just a minute ago had been savoring the warmth of his coffee, now sitting motionless, his eyes brimming with confusion and guilt. She saw it all, but the only thing she felt was emptiness. She'd known the consequences of her actions. She'd anticipated that Mr. Grayson wouldn't let this slide, but hearing those words from his mouth still hit her harder than anything she'd braced herself for. She bit her lip. A voice in her head spoke up. "Apologize, Emily. Just say you won't do it again. Say you understand and keep this job. You need it. Your mom needs it. Luke needs it. Don't let pride ruin everything." But then another voice, stronger, pushed back. "If you back down now, you'll regret it forever." She looked down at the counter, where her apron lay dusted with powdered sugar from someone's half-eaten pancakes. She'd worn it for 5 years, greeted thousands of customers, worked late into the night to cover rent, hospital bills, and textbooks for her brother. 5 years of her life, gone in an instant over a cup of coffee. No, not over a cup of coffee, over a person. Emily took a deep breath. She reached up, slowly untying her apron, each knot loosening behind her back as if she were freeing herself from an invisible chain that had bound her for so long. No one spoke as she set it down on the counter, right in front of Mr. Grayson. But when she opened her mouth, her voice remained low and steady, though it trembled slightly on the final words. "I hope one day you'll see that kindness is worth more than the money you make." No one laughed this time, not a single soul. Even the woman in the green dress no longer wore her mocking smirk. Because they knew Emily had just done something not everyone had the courage to do. She didn't argue, didn't beg. She didn't bow her head. She'd chosen her path. Emily turned and walked away, her shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floor, though in her mind, each step echoed like a tolling bell. No one stopped her, no one dared. But just as her hand touched the door to step outside, a faint voice called from behind. "Miss Emily!" She paused. It was the older man. His voice was weak, but it carried an emotion too raw to conceal. I'm sorry." Emily turned back to look at him. His hand still gripped the coffee mug, trembling now, as if he were clinging to something too precious to lose. She gave a small smile. "You don't need to apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." A single tear slipped silently down the man's weathered face. He bowed his head, letting out a soft choke that only Emily could hear. She took a deep breath, turned away, and pushed the door open. The late afternoon chill wrapped around her instantly, but she didn't feel cold. She only felt free. But what Emily didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated, was that what came next would change her life forever. The door of the Maplewood Diner closed softly behind Emily with a faint click, but in her mind it rang like a final farewell chime. She was gone. The late afternoon wind brushed across her shoulders, tugging at her soft brown hair, but she didn't feel cold, not really. She stood there on the quiet sidewalk, staring at the road ahead without truly seeing it. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden shift. 5 years of working here, every meager paycheck from this diner had kept her afloat, paid for her mother's medicine and supported her brother's college dreams, and now it was all gone. Over a cup of coffee. No, not just over a cup of coffee. Because she chose to do what was right. She took a deep breath, the chill filling her lungs, and slowly closed her eyes. Everything would be okay. But just as she opened them again, a sound from inside the diner snapped her back to reality. A crash, a shout, and then the thudding of footsteps. Emily turned and witnessed a scene that left her stunned. Someone had stepped out of the kitchen. It was Daniel, the head cook, a tall, broad man with calloused hands from years at the stove, his face always stern but known to quietly pack up leftovers for those in need. He stood there, just outside the kitchen door, staring straight at Mr. Grayson. "If Emily goes, I go too." A shockwave rippled through the diner. Some customers exchanged wide-eyed glances, but Mr. Grayson didn't flinch. He glared at Daniel as if he'd just said the most absurd thing imaginable. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I said I quit," Daniel repeated, his voice unwavering. "Emily's one of the best people here. If you think kindness is a reason to fire her, then I don't want to work for you anymore." A real storm began brewing inside the diner. The whispers grew louder. Customers who'd been silent until now started speaking up. "That's ridiculous," a middle-aged man exclaimed. "Losing good staff over a cup of coffee? I always loved having Emily wait my table. She even remembers how I like my eggs. Sunny side up," an elderly woman said, shaking her head. "She makes this place feel warmer." Even the remaining staff exchanged uneasy looks. Some stayed put, but a few stepped out from behind the counter, casting defiant glances at Mr. Grayson. Emily couldn't believe her eyes. She'd thought she was just an ordinary waitress, that her absence wouldn't change a thing here. Clearly, she'd been wrong. Her hands clenched and her eyes stung, not from sadness, from being moved. But just as she was reeling from what was unfolding, a sleek black car pulled silently into the parking lot in front of her. A luxury car. The door opened and a man stepped out. The man who'd drunk that cup of coffee, but now he didn't look like a homeless person anymore. Gone was the tattered coat, the worn-out shoes. Instead, he wore an expensive suit, his polished shoes reflecting the fading sunset. Emily froze. No way. No one inside the diner recognized him at first, but as he stepped through the door, his gray eyes steady and his demeanor poised, someone gasped in disbelief. "My God, that's Richard Caldwell." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Richard Caldwell. Chairman of Caldwell Hospitality, owner of hundreds of restaurants across the country, including the Maplewood Diner. A tremor of shock spread through the room. Mr. Grayson stood rooted to the spot, his face shifting from pale to tense, then back to pale. He tried to speak, but it seemed even he couldn't gather his thoughts. Richard approached the counter, where Emily's apron still lay neatly folded on the surface. He didn't say anything at first, he just looked down at it. Then he turned to Emily. A small smile crept onto his weathered face. "Miss Carter." Emily swallowed hard. She didn't know what would happen next, but she had a feeling this moment was about to change everything. Silence enveloped the Maplewood Diner. Everyone seemed frozen in place as they watched Richard Caldwell, the man who, just minutes ago, had appeared to be a pitiful homeless figure, stride in with the air of a successful business. Mr. Grayson stood motionless. No one could have imagined that the man he'd just scorned, the one Emily had given a coffee to without a thought for payment, was the owner of this entire restaurant chain. Emily still hadn't spoken. She couldn't. A mix of confusion, shock, and a hint of fear threaded through her thoughts. She'd never anticipated an ending like this, but the biggest surprise was yet to come. Richard walked slowly to the counter, where her apron still lay on the surface, a symbol of 5 years of dedication, of tireless days, of the genuine smiles she'd offered to everyone. He brushed his hand lightly over the fabric, then looked up, meeting Emily's eyes. "Miss Carter?" His voice was deep, carrying an unexpected warmth. Emily swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. Richard continued, "Do you know why I was sitting in this diner?" She shook her head. "I've visited hundreds of my restaurants," he said, smiling, not the smile of a businessman, but of someone who just rediscovered something precious. "I always want to know if my staff truly care about the customers, if they serve just because it's their job or because they genuinely see this as a place where everyone is welcome." Emily felt her heart tighten. "And today," Richard said slowly, "you gave me my answer." His gaze shifted to Mr. Grayson, who still hadn't managed a single word. "So, Mr. Grayson," Richard said, his tone losing its warmth, turning cold and sharp as the blade. "It seems Miss Emily here understands customer service better than you do." The room fell silent. A few staff members covered their mouths, unable to believe what they were hearing. Some customers leaned closer, whispering eagerly. Mr. Grayson opened his mouth to speak, but Richard raised a hand, silencing him. "Let me be clear." Richard locked eyes with Grayson. "You fired an employee for being kind to a customer. A cup of coffee, Mr. Grayson, just one cup of coffee, and you threw away one of your best workers." Emily felt her chest constrict. She wasn't sure if this was punishment for Grayson or something bigger. Richard turned to her, his expression softening. "Miss Carter, I'm not just asking you to come back to work here." He smiled. "I want you to be the new manager of the Maplewood Diner." The entire diner erupted. A kitchen worker blurted out a "What?" A few customers clapped, while others looked at Emily with admiration. But Emily, she couldn't believe it. She stared at Richard, then at the apron on the counter. She'd lost this job just minutes ago, and now she was being offered a chance to return, not just as an employee, but as the one running the place. Her voice caught in her throat. I don't know what to say." Richard chuckled softly. "Say thank you. Though honestly, I'm the one who should be thanking you." Emily frowned. Thanking me? Yes, he nodded. You didn't just serve coffee, you served compassion, and you reminded me that what matters most in a diner isn't the revenue, it's how we treat people. Emily felt her throat tighten. Something warm swelled in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She'd done the right thing. She hadn't lost herself, and the universe had answered her. She took a deep breath, looked straight at Richard, and smiled. I accept. The diner exploded in applause. A few staff members rushed over to hug her, while some customers raised their hands in cheers. But one person stayed silent. Mr. Grayson. His face was pale, his eyes dark. He knew he'd lost. Richard gave him one final look and said slowly, I think you understand, Mr. Grayson. You don't need to work here anymore. And with that he was gone. As Mr. Grayson walked out of the diner, Emily didn't watch him go. She looked forward. A new chapter of her life had just begun. One cup of coffee, one small act, but a life changed. Emily's story spread through the town, becoming a symbol of kindness and courage. The Maplewood Diner was no longer just a small eatery. It became a place of compassion, a place where a cup of coffee wasn't just a drink, but a lesson in humanity.